Welcome back, everybody. In today's video, we're going to go over the ultimate buyer's guide for the Gen 2 Montero. Before we get started, let me introduce you to these two cars. This right here is my 1995 Mitsubishi Montero that I call the Hooptero. I've had this one for about 4 years. I got it bone stock and I built it all the way up to where it is now. And over here is one I just picked up. This is a 1995 Mitsubishi Montero LS. Now, I'll go over the differences between the SR and the LS model later, but this one is completely bone stock, just as it is right now. So today, I'm gonna go over the ultimate buyer's guide, what to look for if you're shopping for a Gen 2. We're gonna start by taking a look around the cars. We're gonna look at common failure points, things to look out for while you're test driving them. And then we're gonna go to the whiteboard and I'm gonna break down the differences between not only these two models, but also all the variations in the Gen 2 lineup. So let's get into it. Now, before we get into what to look for when you're buying one of these, let's talk about some of the good. So there's a lot of good to be had in the Gen 2 platform. And if you've watched my other video comparing all three generations, you know that I have a lot of love for the Gen 2. One of the biggest things that I love about it is that it's body on frame, so it's built really sturdy. It's got really heavy duty suspension components, steering components. This thing is just beefy. And so if you're looking for one to go off-road, these two are going to be the one you're looking for. You're gonna look for a Gen 2 platform. They also have this fun old school styling. They're a lot more boxy, whether you have the fender flares or these metal bumped out fenders. They are a little more old school. They've got the boxy look. They've got the straight up and down A-pillars. And so if you're into that styling and you don't like the way the Gen 3 looks, chances are you like the way that the Gen 2 looks. The other thing about these is there's plenty of aftermarket support, and there's aftermarket parts, and there's OEM parts available for them. And so unlike the Gen 1, where there's less parts available for them and they're harder to come by, these have a little more aftermarket support, not as much as the Gen 3 has, but I find these to be a good middle ground. And so it's still pretty easy to find parts for it, and even OEM parts to replace things that are broken. Another thing to mention with this guide is that I'm not aiming to show you how to buy a used car. There's plenty of other guides for that, and you should be aware of things like checking out body damage, how does it run, service history, looking for rust, all of that stuff. That's going to be things that you just should be looking for anyways. I'm going to go over some of the things that are more specific to this car and what you should be looking for if you're going to buy a Gen 2. One thing to mention before we get any further is this is a United States of America buyer's guide. So we did not get any diesel versions of either of these. This is what we're working with. And so the models I'm going to talk about, those are the ones that I'm familiar with. I don't know about the diesel ones. I'm sure that a lot of you guys overseas can chime in about how they're better or worse or things to look out for. But I'm going to speak from experience and talk about these from what I know. So let's start by taking a look underneath the hood. This is the 95 LS, and this is the 3-liter 24-valve motor. So I want to talk about a few things that actually plague all of the Gen 2 motors, regardless of the displacement, regardless of the type. Let's start with the minor ones and work our way towards the more extreme ones. One of the things that's really common on the Gen 2 Montero is going to be something called lifter tick. Now, unfortunately, lifter tick is very, very hard to capture on video, and so I'm not able to get a soundbite for you of what it sounds like. But basically what's happening is there's hydraulic lifters inside of the head of this motor, and as they fill up with oil, they expand and they quiet up, and that's to open and close the valves inside of your engine. What happens with these is the lifters tend to not have a big enough hole to receive oil, and so they stay shrunken down for longer than they're supposed to, which really isn't that big of a deal for your motor. However, it makes an annoying ticking sound. So I notice this especially whether it be a used motor like this that's done 200,000 miles or my freshly rebuilt one, they all just have a little bit of lifter tick. And so what happens is you fire it up, usually when it's cold, and you just hear a tick, 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 and that's the sound that you're looking for. And if you're unaware, it can sound a little bit scary, but if you know that it's lifter tick, if you know that it's common, that might not be that big a deal for this. Now, if you're getting a ton of lifter tick, if it's really excessive, if it won't go away, that might be a concern for you. For a lot of people, it's really annoying, and so that's something to think about, but it's very common on these engines. Another issue with almost every single variation of the Gen 2 Montero is going to be timing belt services and specifically your timing belt tensioner. Now, I have a few videos out about how to do a timing belt. I've got another video explaining why this is so important. But basically what happens is this tensioner is what's holding tension on your timing belt, and it's a hydraulic one. Now, this one just happens to be out of a Gen 3, but the principle is the same. And after some time, after some miles, this starts to leak and this starts to slap back and forth, and you can lose tension on your belt. You can skip teeth, or worse case scenario, you break a belt. These are interference motors, all except for the 92 and 93. And so that'll cause catastrophic failure in your motor. And so you don't want that. And so these need to be changed every 60,000 miles. And it is imperative that you use an OEM tensioner. If you bring it to a regular shop, they're going to use their parts, and you never know what kind of quality you're going to get. The OEM tensioner is the only one that I trust to last. I've seen these fail preemptively as early as 10,000 miles, and this is not a job that you want to do every 10,000 miles. And so to me, this is a big point. If you've got service history, if you're looking to buy one of these and the previous owner has service history, or you can find one of these stickers that says when it's been done, even better if you can find out if they used OEM components. That's a huge selling point. Just for reference, I think doing a timing belt job on one of these cars is roughly $1,500 to $2,000 here in the US. And so if that's something that would deter you, you got to think about that as your price point. Like, let's say you've got one and there's a $1,000 price difference, but one has a brand new timing belt and the other one has no service history. You should pretty much assume that you have to do this job right away. And so you might want to use that as a bargaining chip, or you just might consider it in doing your budget. Personally, I don't find this a huge deal, but I want to mention it. This is your crank bolt pulley, and for some people, this is a huge problem as well. You can see that this bolt is really long, and so what happens is it starts to move around and it starts to back itself out, and if this falls out, that's a big deal. Unfortunately, I can't show you exactly where that goes, but they do make an upgraded part for it. And so if you're doing a timing belt, or if someone's done a timing belt, it'd be a good thing to ask if they've switched to the shorter upgraded bolt, because that's a nice upgrade. The last thing I'll mention underneath the hood is the same issue that I've talked about in other ones like the Gen 3, and I've brought it up in a couple other videos, and that's that the valve stem seals leak in these. Now, this is a 24 valve motor, and so there are 24 valve stem seals to leak. This car is from 95, it's quite old, and so those valve stem seals, they go bad, they start to leak oil into the combustion chamber, and you start to see it come out the exhaust. So if you've got blue smoke on startup especially, or if you're burning oil, you know that those valve stem seals are probably bad. Depending on how bad it is, it might be something that you consider. I have yet to find a motor that doesn't burn a little bit of oil. This one's actually in great condition. It's only burning about a quart every 3,000 miles, which to me is completely acceptable for its age and something I wouldn't be concerned about. But on my other Gen 2, I was burning a quart of oil every time I filled up the gas tanks. So about every 200 or 300 miles. So that was way too much. I ended up having to rebuild that motor. That's a lot of oil. So one thing to talk about when you are checking this out from the previous owner is to ask, how much oil does it burn? If they don't know, you should be suspicious. You should be able to check the dipstick and see where the oil's at. And if they have a good idea of how much it burns, that can be helpful in deciding how healthy is this motor. So those are the major things under the hood. Now let's talk about the exterior of the car. One thing that you're going to notice right away looking at both of my rigs is the sun fading on the front fenders and on the hood. And if you could see it, it's also on the roof. So let's start over here, because this has not been painted. This is stock. And as you can see here, there's this clear coat that is peeling. And I've already even come in here and I've cleaned this up a bit with a razor blade, but this is extremely common. The paint they used, and especially the clear coat, was just not very high quality. I'm sure some years are better than others, but almost every single Gen 2 that I see has some kind of issue here. You can see right here, there might have been some kind of repair done here, but this is starting to crack, and you've got all of this stuff bubbling up, and it's usually on the top of these fenders, on the side, on the hood, and on the roof. Over here, you can see a similar thing. This is kind of a different issue. I believe that this was repainted based on the way that it looks. It looks a different color than the rest of the car, but you can clearly see here all of this sun fading. It's taken away the clear coat, it's chipping away, and that goes all the way up. It follows the roof line. You can see it coming up here. Anything that is exposed to the sun tends to have this kind of wear on it. So unfortunately, if you're looking for one of these and you really don't like the way this looks, this is going to be a hard one for you because it's so common. Like I said, there's other years. Sometimes you can find one that's been parked in a garage, and so it doesn't have this issue because it hasn't been baked in the sun. But this is a really common one. If it hasn't happened to you yet, it'll probably start happening to you. And unfortunately, the only real way to get rid of it is to repaint the car, which is extremely expensive. So that's something to definitely think about when you're buying one of these. Something else to consider when you're buying a Gen 2 is there's going to be some steering wheel slop. So I mention this because if you're used to driving modern cars with a rack and pinion, this feels like a big old truck. So let me show you why that's the case and maybe how to fix it or things to look out for when you are buying this. So the Gen 2 uses a steering box, like I mentioned before, and you can see it right here. This is true of all models. They all use a steering box like this, and that comes down to a pitman arm. And that pitman arm is attached to a rod that goes to each side of the car, which attaches to the tie rods. Now, these tie rods aren't super different from a regular rack and pinion like you'd find on a Gen 3 or any modern car. However, there's a couple things that produce slop. One is going to be the steering box itself. These get worn out. They work on a gear system. There's a little bit of adjustment to it, but no matter what you do, this will not feel like a rack and pinion. It's going to have some slop in it. You're going to have some side-to-side motion, so be prepared for that. A little bit is okay. A lot might be dangerous on the road. The other thing is this pitman arm right here has a ball joint right there, and that can wear out, especially if it hasn't been replaced, and that can create slop. And then over here on the passenger side, we have the idler arm. And the idler arm bolts right there. It's this long shaft that comes down here, and then the arm, which connects to that rod that connects to tie rods. And here's what I found with these, is these like to bend when you off-road pretty hard. They're held in single shear in the sense that there's nothing on the bottom here holding that on, and so they easily bend. There are some upgraded kits for it. The OEM parts are the best, but when you break them, then you got to go aftermarket or you got to track down another OEM one. So this is something to keep in mind because this is a pretty easy part to fix. And so if you get slop in the steering wheel, it could be as simple as knocking this out and putting a better one in, or it could be your steering box going bad. It's a good idea to get somebody in the car, have them shake the wheel back and forth and see what's moving. It's likely going to be either this idler arm, the pitman arm, or just the slop in the box. While I'm in this wheel well, let's talk about bushings. I mentioned this in a lot of other videos, but you got to figure these bushings are about 30 years old if they're the originals. It doesn't matter how well the car's been taken care of. That rubber is dried out, and it's going to be problematic, especially if you take it off-road. Thankfully, there are kits for replacing those bushings. As you can see, I've got some polyurethane ones up here. These ones down here are actually the stock ones, and they're still holding up okay. But that's something to inspect. It's a kind of a pain to replace bushings. You can get a shop to do it, and there are parts available, so that's nice. But it's something to consider when you're gonna buy these, because you could end up buying it and then having to put it right back in the shop to get those bushings changed. Another very common issue with these Gen 2 Monteros is the sunroof. To my knowledge, almost every single Gen 2 comes with a sunroof, which is really nice, and it's huge. Unfortunately, it's placed behind the driver's seat, so it's really only for your passengers. And the other thing about this is almost every single Gen 2 that I know of has a bad motor. And people have sometimes tried to fix these. You can get motors that work and you can actuate this and it works for a little bit, but I think it was too big of a sunroof, too big of a job for the motor that it has. And what happens is people start opening and closing these and then they break, and then their sunroof is either left open or they can't get it closed all the way. It causes leaks, and then you have a wet interior. There's also an issue where maybe it doesn't seal quite right on the outside. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. Here's what I like to do when I'm buying these is I ask the previous owner, the owner that I'm buying from, hey, does the sunroof work? And if they say, I've never opened it, I've never tried, I don't try it. If they say it works 100%, I guarantee it, then I'll give it a shot. But what ends up happening is you press this button back, it kind of gets stuck in the back position, and then it won't go forward, and you have to figure it out. Thankfully, if you're in this situation, there is this little plastic cover right here. You pop that out, and then there's a 5mm Allen screw, and you can turn that, and it works best if you get a buddy to kind of pull forward on it and push up on it while you turn that to make sure it's sealed. Now, to me, this isn't a huge deal. If you really want to rock the sunroof open, you could theoretically open it with this. However, I recommend if it's sealed and it's not working, just leave it as it is. I wouldn't even bother fixing it. And if this is a deal breaker for you as you're going around looking at Monteros, just know almost every single Gen 2 has a problem with the sunroof. So since we're on the interior, let's talk about some issues on the inside of the car, starting with the tachometer. These are known for having tachometer issues. Obviously, you can see right here, I'm going 35 miles an hour, but my tachometer reading at absolute 0. There's a couple fixes for these. You can try to resolder it, but honestly, I've tried to resolder this one. You can see it's still at 0. Every once in a while when I hit a bump, it comes back and then it'll go away just as quick. So this is a very common issue. If you have it on a Montero that you're looking at, chances are that's just how it's gonna be. So might as well live with it. While we're talking about gauges, let me bring up another one that freaks people out. Here's your oil pressure gauge. And the reason I bring this up is because a lot of people, when they jump into my car, they can see this from the passenger seat and they look at this and say, hey, is your oil pressure okay? Because it reads awfully low. Right now, you'd guess that's probably about 15 PSI. And normally a car, when it's idling, should be above 40 or something. Here's what I found with these. Every single one that I've gotten in reads low. and I haven't had an issue with it. It seems like they have plenty of oil pressure. Doesn't seem to be an actual issue. As soon as I give it gas, it kind of goes up near the 50 or the 60, but this seems to be a really common thing that gauge reads pretty low. It should be viewed as a dummy gauge anyways. I wouldn't view this as an absolute truth, but I just wanted to point that out. So don't let that scare you if you're buying one. If it's a little low, but otherwise it seems healthy, it's probably fine. This is another kind of odd but very common failure point in these Gen 2s is this stock right here. You can see it's just flopping around. I can put it into both modes of turning left or right, and everything still works, but there's a little plastic bit in here that breaks off, and it just flops around like that. So something to look out for on your Gen 2. Another kind of odd issue that I found when I was test driving a lot of these, and I've test driven probably 20 Gen 2s in my buying process, is that a lot of times the power mirrors don't work. I'm not entirely sure why this is. I've even swapped out this switch. It seems to be something else in the system, but a lot of times the power mirrors don't work, so you have to adjust them manually by pushing on them, and that's not that great, but it seems to be a really common failure point, and so you might have that situation as well. The other thing about the mirrors is sometimes this glass tends to wobble around, and that was the case with this one when I first got it. You can see there's a little bit of movement in it, but I've tightened it up a lot. And the way you tighten it up is there's actually just a screw hole right there, and if you stick a Phillips head screw in there, you can go ahead and tighten up a screw, and that's what holds this glass in place, and that will make a world of difference. So if your mirror's flopping around, you don't need a new mirror, you just need to tighten up that screw at the bottom. The last issue I'll point out on the interior here is these four-wheel drive lights, and you can see I've got it shifted into 4 high, but I don't have the car on, so it's not going to lock these out. But I find that these two bulbs specifically, because they're always on in any mode that you drive the car, those are burned out all the time. And so if you get in the car and those aren't lit up, they are supposed to be lit up, and you're going to have to change those. It's not particularly difficult, but that's a really common thing. You should have all of the lights be able to light up. And I find that those go out pretty often. So that wraps us looking at the outside of the vehicles, the inside of the vehicles, and the engine bay to talk about what goes wrong with them. And let me give you just 2 hot takes on the Gen 2 platform. The first one is that I find that out of all the Montero models, these actually have the least amount of problems. Obviously, I mentioned some more major, but out of all the generations of Monteros, I think these are the most reliable. They've still got regular issues, like you've got to check them for oil leaks, and you've got different little things that'll go wrong, like the ones I mentioned. But the Gen 1 tends to be a lot more finicky. It's just old enough that you have to always be messing with it, and the Gen 3 is just high-tech enough that it's got all sorts of other issues that these don't have. But the other thing I'll mention is I think these ones are actually the hardest to work on. It seems because they're more robust, it's a little harder to get to certain spots, especially on the suspension and steering components. And they aren't as simple as the Gen 1 because they've got modern motors and modern safety amenities. So things to think about with these. I think they're the most robust. I think they have the least issues, but I think they're the hardest ones to work on. So with that, let's head to the whiteboard and I'll show you guys the differences between not only these two, but also all the other variations of the Gen 2. So you can hopefully figure out which one is right for you. So now that we've looked at the cars, let's look at the whiteboard and let's talk about the differences in each model and the different years and the different options so that you can get a good idea of which one's right for you and the differences between all of them. So let's start over here. This started in 1992. So from 1992 to 2000 is the year of the Gen 2. We are going to talk a little bit right over here about the Gen 2.5. I'll get into that in a little bit, but it started in 92. And so from 92 to 94, they were relatively the same. Few things to point out with this. This has the holdover engine from the Gen 1. It's going to be the 3-liter 12-valve engine. This is a non-interference V6. This was the one that came out in the later Gen 1s and in almost, I think it came out in all of the 4-door ones. So this motor is still going to be around. It's non-interference. That's about the only advantage to it. Otherwise, it's very slow, and the Gen 1 is lighter than the Gen 2, and so it's even slower in the Gen 2 platform. The other thing that happened when they moved from the Gen 1 to the Gen 2 is all of them, at least in the United States, became 4 doors. So for those of you who are overseas, you're going to notice a few things. One, we did not get any 2-door versions of the Gen 2. And the other thing is we didn't get any diesels. We have no diesel Gen 2s in the United States unless they're imported. And so I'm just covering the ones that are in the US. And so those are 2 changes. All of them are moving forward are going to be 4 doors. And then the other thing that happened here is they had the same motor as the previous generation. So I need to jump in here and make a few corrections before we continue the video. The first one is that you can see the years say 92 to 94, and that's supposed to say 92 to 93. The other thing that I became made aware of after I made this video is that the SR version actually started in 93. And so there's a couple models that have an SR version in 93, and those seem to be interesting. Some of them came with a locker, some of them have bigger diffs, some of them are the exact same with a few appearance package things. I wasn't able to get a whole lot of information on them, but I wanted to clear that up before moving forward. So then we move over to 94 to 96. For the vast majority, this is going to be your bulk of the Gen 2s. They made the most during this time, and this is where we get two differentiations. We get the LS and the SR, like I mentioned before. So the ones I showed you before, that's going to be a 95 LS, that's the stock one, and an SR, that's the one that I built up that I call the Montero. Let's start with the LS. What's interesting about this is the LS model for the generation before this, that was the more nice one. That was the one with the more limited options. That was the one you wanted to have versus the RS, that was the more base one. In this case, it's actually swapped. The LS is the base model and the SR is going to be the fancier one. So a little bit of a change, and it can be a little confusing since they just swapped some letters there. But let's talk about the LS. The LS is going to have the 3.0 24 valve motor. This is an interference engine. It's going to have a little more power than the outgoing 12 valve one. I don't love this motor. I think it's pretty slow, but it's simple, it's reliable. You've got that. The other thing you get is you get cloth manual seats in the LS trim. You're going to have open diffs in the front and the rear, and you're going to have smaller differentials. The front differential is going to be a 7.25 inch ring gear, and the rear is going to be a 9-inch ring gear. You're also going to have metal fender flares. I'll put in a video here of what those look like. So they're actually built into the bodywork rather than the SR, which is going to have the plastic flared ones. And then the other notable thing about the LS model that some people really love is you were able to get it in a manual transmission. This is the only one where you could get a manual transmission. So if that's a really big deal to you, you're going to be shopping for an LS. Now let's look at the SR. To me, this is the more desirable one. There's some good, there's some bad. We'll get into it. So this one comes with a different motor entirely. It comes with a 3.5 dual overhead cam 24 valve. This is different than the one that comes in the later models, and it's different than the one that comes in the Gen 3. It is unique to these 3 years, 94, 95, 96. That makes it a little rare. As someone who's blown one of these up and had to source one, it's not that fun. And so it is a better motor. It's going to have butterfly valves that can drop into the cylinder. I've covered that in a few videos, so that's a maintenance item to keep track of. It's a little more complicated. It's quite large. It does make a little more power, so maybe that's important to you. But either way, that's what comes in the SR in all of them. It's going to have leather power seats, at least for the front. So the leather is throughout the whole thing, but the front seat, specifically the driver's seat, is going to be power. The rest of them are going to be manual. This is where the big differences come in. It's going to have a rear air locker. And if you're into off-roading, if you're into really get out there, pushing the limits, flexing out your car, this is a huge deal. And it's worth noting that to add one later might cost you $1,000 or maybe $1,500. And so this can be a really expensive thing, and it's really nice to have it from the factory. So that's a huge advantage. It also has the bigger gears. It's got an 8-inch ring gear in the front and a 9.5-inch ring gear in the back. And the back axle is absolutely massive. It's a sizable unit. It's worth noting. That's a really good upgrade. The other thing I want to point out between these is each of these, they both have the 4.63 gears. So they have the same gear ratio in them regardless. It's just the ring gear size that changes. Another thing to note as far as the aesthetics, like I mentioned, these are going to have the plastic fenders, and they're actually going to have bigger stock tires from the factory. So if you look at the sticker of what actually comes on the car, the LS is going to have slightly smaller tires than the SR. Now, you can fit whatever size tire on there, well, on both of them equally. And so it's not a huge limiting factor, but from the factory, these come with the bigger tires, hence the bigger flares. A couple other things that are maybe valuable, some are more valuable than others. The SR is going to come with ABS. The reason I say this is somewhat valuable is almost every single SR that I know of, the ABS is not working. That's true about mine. It's true about all my buddies. There's just so many sensors and they tend to go bad. So it might have the ability to do ABS, but you might not actually be able to get it running. And so it's kind of a wash between them. The other thing it has is adjustable suspension. And contrary to popular belief, you can actually still source parts for this. Not all of them, but I've been able to find shock absorbers for this for this adjustable suspension. And they are kind of nice. If you're really planning on building it, these are going to leave you lacking. If you just want to drive it around town, this can be nice. It allows you to shift on the fly from soft to medium to hard. it is a nice feature and at the time, very luxurious. The other thing it has that I think is kind of gimmicky, and again, I haven't seen many of them working, are the headlight sprayers. I say it's gimmicky because you very rarely need to use them, and it's kind of a pain if they stop working to get them working. It's a whole nother washer fluid system. It doesn't get used very much, and so things tend to seize. But it's worth mentioning, those three options are only on the SR models. They are not on the LSs. And that brings us to 1997. This is an interesting year. To be honest, I don't know a ton about this year. I haven't seen a bunch of them, but doing some research online, I figured out a few things. It's going to maintain the same body style, so nothing's going to change from 92 to 97 as far as the body style goes. However, it's going to have a little bit different motor. So the engine in it is going to be a 3.5 single overhead cam that you're going to see in the later years and in the beginning models of the generation after it, so the Gen 3. It's also going to have 4.3 gears. So if you'll notice, that's a different gear ratio than the 4.63 here. And to make up for that, there's a difference in the motor. So a little more power, little less gear. That's how they're getting by with that. So that's the 97 model. Like I said, it's a little different. I haven't seen a ton of them, but this motor and gear package transfers into the later model, and that's the Gen 2.5. A lot of people would say, hey, you should look at the Gen 2 and the Gen 2.5 as completely different things. However, they are mostly the same generation. They have the same chassis. They've got a lot of same components. So I'm going to lump them here together. Maybe if I actually get my hands on a 98, 99, or 2000, I'll do a separate video discussing the differences. But for the sake of this comparison, I'm going to go over them real quick. The biggest difference you're going to see here is that they are a different body style. So they've got boxed out fender flares that actually come out. People love them. They think they look really cool. Some people refer to them as blister fenders. I think they look really cool as well. Instead of having the plastic, there's a lot more boxy. They look a little more aggressive. So that's one thing you're going to notice for sure is the blistered fenders. Like I said before, they're going to have the same motor, so the same 3.5 single overhead cam motor that was in this generation and exists in the 2001 and 2002 Gen 3s. And they're going to have the 4.3 gears. One thing to mention as far as packages go, if you're looking at the LS or the SR, they kind of ditched that in the 2.5 and they moved to something called the winter package. So either have a standard or you have a winter package. The winter package came with a couple different options. The big one is the locker. So if you want to go off-road, if you want to beat it up, a locker is a huge advantage, especially if you can get it from the factory. The winter package has the locker in it. And they also have heated seats. They might have a few other things that I'm missing, but as far as I know, that's the big deal with the winter package. So that's an overview of some of the different options, some of the different years, some of the different features you can get in the Gen 2 Montero. So there it is. That's my buyer's guide for the Gen 2 Montero. Now, before I wrap this up, let me just say that I think this model has the most variations between the different years and the different trim packages. For example, I mentioned this in the video for a little bit. Some of the SR models have the upgraded features. Some of the LS models seem to have some of those features as well. Then you've got the 93 and the 97, which are kind of a variation between the Gen 1 and the incoming Gen 2.5. And so there's a little bit of variation in there, and I wasn't able to account for all of it. So hopefully this serves as a good baseline for a buyer's guide. But like I mentioned before, I think that the Gen 2 is my favorite platform. I love it. Obviously, this one is way modified. I've taken this all over the place, really enjoyed it. And if you're shopping for one, I hope you find one that meets all of your needs, and I hope this guide is helpful. So with that, I'll catch you guys on the next one.